Hi, I'm Chris Davis. This is my father Roy Davis and my uncle Rick Davis. My grandpa's been making wall tents and pack gear in Colorado since 1955. I remember walking around on my knees or barely crawling in Grandpa's basement where the company first started, and my dad joined up, and they moved into a building and they grew some more, and then my uncle joined up, and now we're here in this 25,000 square foot building, and I just can't wait to see what I can add to the company.
One of my favorite pictures in the picture book I was just talking about is you standing in one of the tents Dad had set up in the backyard, and Father, my dad's great-grandfather, standing in there with you.
Yep.
I think that the best part of our job is we get to swap stories with customers about hunting and fishing and things like that. So it's a great industry to be in. You never really run into a sad sack customer in our business. When people are buying a tent, they're tickled to death. They're buying themselves a gift, and they're wonderful to work with. And I can't tell you how much I enjoy being in this business.
I think the success of our business is attributed to several things, but the biggest one is we offer a great product at a fair price, and we will give you our honest opinion regardless of what the question is.
And if we don't know the answer, we'll make something up.
We've
kind
done
of
that
the rule of
before.
thumb around here.
We've done it before.
Today we're going to go over a few different questions we've received over the years and explain it in more detail.
I think it's important to express that the purpose of this video is not to sell you our tent or our products. It's to educate you so you know what to look for when you're purchasing your wall tent or your camping gear.
Dad, you want to start us off by talking about why we use cotton canvas?
Wall tents have been around for years, and the reason they're still around is they're extremely functional. Cotton canvas is the material of choice due to its natural ability to breathe. Just 4 people in a tent will emit 2 liters of moisture from their breath at night. Cotton canvas is able to breathe, so you don't get that condensation. We sell the same type of canvas or material in 3 grades. We have an untreated canvas, also known as gray goods, a water and mildew treated, which is the water and mildew sun forger treatment, and water, mildew, and fire retardant also is a sun forger treatment.
There's different types of treatments out there. We use what's called a sun forger treatment. The idea behind this treatment is it allows a canvas to remain porous and breathable, so you won't experience a condensation problem inside the tent. Oftentimes after hunting season, we will get phone calls from people saying, "What the heck's going on with my tent? We had water dripping on us and it wasn't even raining outside." Obviously, this is a condensation problem. With the sun forger treatment on our canvas, it is not like the other treatments that some manufacturers will use. That is a waxy finish that does not allow the tent to breathe. There's a reason there isn't a waxy finish on your blue jeans, on your t-shirt, on your underwear. Your tent has to remain breathable just like your clothing does to create a comfortable environment.
The reason we prefer the sun forger treatment, it retains cotton's natural ability to breathe. It doesn't plug up the pores like lesser quality treatments can.
It doesn't matter whether you buy a tent from us or one of our competitors. The key thing is the sun forger label on there. That's the one label that is going to allow you to have a breathable, porous tent.
That's been true since Grandpa started in '55 and still true today.
When my grandpa first started making wall tents here in Colorado, he had the handshake warranty. And we're still going to use that here today. If something fails on our product, we will stand behind it 100%.
I would say that, if there's anything that ever goes wrong that's our fault, we'll fix it. We can't be responsible for burn holes or bullet holes.
True.
It's sad, but we've had to fix them.
Yeah, we fixed a number of bullet holes too. We've earned our reputation by saying we're not happy unless you're happy.
And yeah, there's a lot of good things out there about us. And really what that is about the products, the sun forger. That's been out for, since Vivitex lost the patent and sun forger ran them into the ground in the 50s. So the sun forger is a proven product that's been around for, 6 decades. It'll be interesting to see the reviews on some of those imported products 60 years from now.
How long they held up
Exactly.
in the sun.
My name is Davis. Don't believe a word any of us are saying. Go to Google, type in Davis tent. Behind it in the search box, type in Davis Tent Review or Davis Tent Forums and see what other people say about our product.
I would like to thank anybody that's purchased a tent from us in the past. Hopefully we hear from you down the road, or we hear from one of your buddies that loved the product and had a chance to sleep in it or stay in it or help you set it up.
You know, that's great, Rick. I'm excited for Christopher. You know, it's funny the changes I've seen. Having Dad's picture books crammed full of pictures that customers over the years have sent him. You know, we haven't got a picture in the mail in 3 or 4 years. We get them on Facebook now. They're all digital.
Yeah, they're all digital.
I wonder what Christopher's kids are going to get, or what Christopher's going to get. So.
You know, we get a lot of different phone calls here asking us questions about the different weights of our canvas. Dad, you want to tell us the difference between like a 10 ounce and a 12 ounce?
You know, in most cases, a 10 ounce is actually the better choice. We think it's the really sweet spot between performance and weight. One of the biggest mistakes we've seen when people go to purchase a wall tent is they assume that heavier is better, that a 12-ounce canvas must be better than a 10-ounce canvas, or that a 14-ounce canvas is better than a 12-ounce or 10-ounce. They equate that weight to being more durable. That's simply not true. I like to compare it to buying a bed sheet. When you go to buy quality linen, they don't tell you how heavy the bed sheet is. They tell you how many threads per inch there are. Our 10-ounce canvas is known in the industry as double fill. What that means is they take 2 lighter threads and twist it into 1 heavier thread before they start the weaving process. This dual fill or double fill is done in both directions, the warp and the weft, and that's how it creates equal strength in both directions. This is how a 10-ounce canvas can be superior to a 12-ounce or a 14-ounce that's single fill. And the Sun Forager treatment that we pay extra for retains this canvas's natural ability to breathe. We get approached 3 or 4 times a week from other manufacturers supplying a lower grade quality of treatment that we choose not to use.
I think one of the biggest things about the Sun Forager treatment, it's a lifetime treated fabric. So you never have to retreat it, store it dry, it should last you the rest of your life.
One of the questions that comes up is, well, I see your competitor has a 12-ounce fabric. Why shouldn't I buy a 12-ounce from them? Obviously, basic mathematics tells us that a 12-ounce tent is going to weigh 20% more than a 10-ounce tent. Is the trade-off in weight for this tent weighing 20% more? Are you going to benefit 20% more? Absolutely not. If you're one of our glamping customers, somebody that's putting a tent up on a deck, and it's going to be used as a cabin, going to be up year-round, 12 ounces is a great idea. Our regular customers that are going to use a tent 1, maybe 2 weeks out of the year, the overall weight of the tent is extremely important. People will call and say, I'm going to end up setting this up by myself. I'm worried about the overall weight of the tent. Do I want a 12 ounce? Of course you don't. Obviously that tent's going to weigh 20% more. You're not going to get 20% better use out of it. You're setting it up 1 time out of the year. The 10 ounce is going to function absolutely beautiful for you.
You also have the guys that are packing out on horses or mules. They're going to want to carry in a 10-ounce fabric versus a 12-ounce fabric just to cut down on 20% of the weight.
And I was thinking, as you were talking, Rick, there's customers Dad had in the 50s that are still using those 10-ounce tents.
Good point. Roy, I've seen in some of our competitors' literature that they offer a 10.38. We offer a 10.10. Would you mind explaining the difference?
You know, that's a great question, and there's so many buzzwords in our industry, it's really hard to compare apples to apples. What 10.38 is, that's the canvas's weight prior to treatment. So the canvas actually weighs more before it is treated. And the reason it weighs less after it's treated is because it shrinks. The 100% cotton, like in a pair of jeans, will shrink a couple inches and 3 foot in the length of your legs. If you are truly buying a 10.38 canvas tent, you're buying an untreated tent, or a tent they call in the gray good form. Any tent that's been treated, or any canvas that's been treated and made into a tent, typically will weigh 10.10 ounces. So I think it's important when you're comparing wall tents to compare apples to apples. make sure you're comparing the same grade of canvas, the 10-ounce double fill marine grade cotton army duck with the Sunforger treatment, to another tent of the same quality, the same material, same treatments.
Well, we get people that call here that say, well, I see your competitor has a synthetic wall tent that weighs 17 pounds. The downside, in our opinion, is all of those synthetics are not breathable. They create condensation. You'll get up in the morning, your sleeping bag will be damp, the clothes you took off the night before will be damp, there'll be a layer of moisture on your kitchen table. You need to stick with breathable, porous cotton canvas in an effort to create the most comfortable environment you can. You don't want to wake up in the middle of the night and have water dripping from the ceiling and say, what the heck's that? That's not even raining outside. So the end user will have a much more comfortable climate inside the tent if they stay with a breathable cotton canvas. The best way to store a tent is actually in some type of Rubbermaid tote. We roll the tent up in there, drop it in there. It's going to serve three functions. It's going to be a place where the tent is going to store dry. It's also going to be a mouse-proof container, which is really a big issue for people that store their tents out in a shed, a barn, a garage, any of those type of places. Plus, it's great for transport. I can pick it up by the handles, throw it in the back of my truck, pile all kinds of gear on top of it. I don't have to worry about damaging the tent in any way. Once I get home, I take the tent back out of the tote, open it up, lay it out on the garage floor, driveway, something like that, make sure it's good and dry, roll it back up. We do have an instructional video on how to roll the tent up on our website. Put it back in that tote, put it away for the year. I know I'm good to go.
I think that's a great point. I would say don't buy a tote based on the tent when you receive it from us. Take the tent out of the box we ship it in, use it, fold it up a couple times your way, see what you get size-wise when you're done folding it the way you're gonna fold it, then buy a tote, a trash can with a lid, a gang box. Some customers will make their own wooden box to store the tent in, but make sure you make the purchase or the box big enough for your tent after you fold it.
And I think going back to care and maintenance, we talked about never retreating the tent. The idea behind never retreating the tent is when you receive the tent from us, it'll be a porous, breathable piece of fabric. If you set the tent up in your backyard and go over it with some aftermarket waterproofer, no matter what is in that waterproofer, it's going to go into the pores of that tent and clog up all of the pores, and your tent will no longer be breathable. After every hunting season, we get a handful of phone calls from people. What the heck's going on with my tent? We had water dripping on us, it wasn't even raining. The answer always is, well, yeah, I retreated it. The tent was 6 years old or 7 years old. They forget that we told them never retreat the tent.
Something else you should never do to your tent is take it to a high pressure washer. A lot of guys after the season want to clean their tent. The best way to do that is get a cup of like a Dawn dish soap or a Woolite, something with a real light detergent. Put it in a bucket with 5 gallons of water. Kind of go over those dirty spots with a light thistle brush and just hose it off real gently. Thumb pressure over the hose only. Don't want to get too forceful with it.
Yeah, I'm not sure why the wand marks on the high pressure washers kind of blow out the treatments or separates the fibers, but I've seen many tents that's been ruined by somebody using the pressure washer.
It seems like when you use a high pressure washer, it just separates the weed pattern of that fabric, and you can turn the garden hose loose on it and the water will run right through it.
Absolutely.
That's a shame. And back to your point, Rick, there's no aftermarket treatment that you can apply to the tent that's near the quality of Sunforger. That's why we pay extra or ship the canvas to Butler, Georgia to get that Sunforger treatment. We pay extra for it because we feel it's the best.
I think another question I get quite often is, how come wall tents are always white? The reason that wall tents are white is the amount of daylight that's allowed in. The amount of sunlight that comes in there to where you don't have to have a lantern on during the day. If you want to lay on your cot and read a book, you don't have to have a lantern on. If we go to colors that are something other than white, you take an overcast day, it's pretty dark in there. You're gonna have a lantern on probably to go in and make lunch.
I think one of the most common questions I get is, what size of tent should I buy? And that's really a subjective answer or a subjective question. It's hard to answer. I would say, or the way I answer it most frequently is, far and away, without a doubt, the most common size of tent we sell is the 14 by 16. Most people report that being a perfect size for 4 people. One of the biggest, one of the biggest mistakes people make when they buy a wall tent, they buy a tent that's too small. I've never heard anybody call me up and say, man, I love my tent, I wish I'd have bought a smaller one.
Probably a number one mistake.
Number one mistake.
You're never disappointed in more room. Exactly right.
So what's one of the more common questions you get?
Well, definitely on the size thing. I always ask, are you trying to eat, cook, sleep, the whole 9 yards in there? Because if you're just going to use it strictly as a sleeping tent, you can get away with a little bit smaller of a tent. But if you're going to try to do it all in one, 14 by 16, like you were saying, for 4 guys is great for eating, cooking, and sleeping. But if you're just going to strictly sleep, you can get 6 to 7 guys in that tent.
Good point.
People will call me and say, well, my bedroom's 10 by 12 and it's plenty big enough. I think they forget that that bedroom has 8-foot ceilings. When you start getting down to a 5-foot ceiling and you have that 30-degree slope on your tent, that kind of gets lost in the shuffle. The biggest thing that you can do, or biggest favor you can do yourself, is do some type of schematic, whether it be take some sidewalk chalk and go out on your driveway in the front yard and do it to full scale, 14 by 16, 12 by 14, or do it to scale on a piece of paper and pencil in the amount of cots you plan on having in there, your wood stove, your kitchen table, your coolers, everything you plan on having in there, and then get the next size up.
And,
True.
and I'm actually working on a program for our computer, which will enable you to do just that on our website.
If you think you need a 16 by 20, usually the next thing is guys get intimidated. Can I set that tent up by myself, or what's that tent gonna weigh? You know, a 16 by 20, a water mildew treated tent's gonna weigh about 75 pounds. Something you could definitely manage by yourself. And with a little bit of practice, you could definitely set that tent up by yourself.
It'd be much easier with a second person, and the second person could be a 4-year-old.
Absolutely.
If you're using the internal frame, there's a point when you lift one side of the tent and your helper could just stick the legs under, but definitely doable by yourself. Very simple with 2 people.
I would say common feedback would be the first time I set my tent up, it took me 45 minutes. The second time I did, it took me 20 minutes.
And I think the variable there is how hard the ground is you're staking into. If the ground's fighting you driving the stakes in the ground, it's going to take you longer than if the ground's going readily, or the stakes go in the ground readily. Make sure you use all the ropes and all the stakes every time. The tent is 100% cotton. It's been run through the vat twice. It's what they call boat shrunk. Means most of the shrinkage has been removed from the material, but it will shrink if allowed to. So make sure that you use all the ropes and all the stakes every time to hold that tent in place on the frame.
Another question that comes up on just about every conversation we have about tents with a customer is, well, what kind of wind will this tent hold up to? We have a saying around here that is 100% accurate. We've seen our tents blow over in 15-mile-an-hour wind, and I had a guy in here a couple of weeks back that was in 128-mile-an-hour wind gust, and his tent held up perfectly. He said, you know what, that's a testament to your product. I said, no, that's a testament to who set it up. It goes back to what Roy said. If your ropes are always as tight as they can be at all times, and you use every rope we provide you, there's not a reason in the world the wind should knock your tent down. If it does, you set it up wrong.
Yeah, and the tighter your tent set up, the better it's going to perform for you as well.
Yeah, the only difference between the tent that blew over in 15-mile-an-hour winds and the one that withstood the high winds was who put them up.
Exactly.
So do yourself a favor, set it up right the first time.
We provide you with all those ropes for a reason.
Absolutely.
And that's where your tent is going to get its strength, is from those ropes. Go around once a day. If you're up there for 10 days, go around once a day, check all your ropes, make sure all of the rope tension are as tight as they can be at all times, and you should never have a problem.
I would like to talk a little bit about cut size tents. You know, some of our competitors will have you believe a cut size tent like ours will finish a foot short of the advertised size. That's simply not true. The reason we have a cut size tent is we are working with 100% cotton canvas, and right in the middle of the roll, the material can change widths a half of an inch or so. Doesn't sound like that big a deal, but you times it by 4 or 5 seams, you can have 2 or 3 inches difference on tents cut at the same day, at the same time, let alone weeks, months, years apart. So every tent we make is a little bit of an individual. We measure every single tent we make. We provide a cut list for that specific tent. That's why it's important for you guys to get your cut list and then put it in a place where you can find it again. So if you break a pole or lose a pole, you can readily replace it. Our finish sizes of our tents are normally very, very close. Like a 14 by 16 might actually finish 14 foot 1 wide and 16 foot 3 long, an inch or two big, or they might finish an inch or two small, but never more than that. Now that we've been doing more and more sports shows in the Northwest, a lot of the people up there put their stove jack out the wall, not out the roof. I know Grandpa's reasoning for our standard location is here in Colorado, we don't get the rain that they do. The stove will draw better with the stovepipe running straight up through the roof. The thermal updraft from the hot air rising will suck more fresh air in at the bottom of the stove, so the stove draws better with the stove jack going out the roof. You are subject to getting a few more burn holes in your tent from sparks landing back down on your tent, and the stove jack leaks. So the people in Portland and stuff, it seems to be more common in that area to put the stove jack out the wall, which is probably a good idea as far as getting the sparks further away from the tent. The downside is the stove doesn't draw as well because you don't get such a dramatic thermal updraft with that pipe run at an angle. The stove doesn't draw as well. So there's pros and cons each way.
Right, when we start putting 90s and 45s in our stovepipe, we're severely restricted the air draft to our stove. So it's common sense says it's not going to operate as efficiently as it would if you just went straight up, correct?
And when you go up straight through your roof, you definitely want to make sure you have enough stovepipe to be above your ridge line. 2 feet is definitely the minimum. Anything you do to go above that is a bonus.
I would say I like the stove jack by the front door, so you're not carrying your firewood all the way in and your ashes all the way out of your tent, and having it by the front will help keep the entryway dry as well. So left or right, I don't think there's a big advantage. The reason ours is on the left is most people are right-handed. So when you unzip the door of your tent, you use your right hand to go in the door of the tent. So the stove on the left is more out of the way. If you're one of the few people that set their tent up in the same location, the same way every time, think about which way the wind predominantly blows and put your stove jack on the downwind side. So you're blowing the smoke and the sparks away from your tent instead of across it.
The stove jack being in the front left or front right corner is there for this reason. That's as close as we can get the stove to what we call the high traffic area, where you're going to unzip the tent, walk in the tent. That's where you're going to track in the most mud, the most snow, things like that. The closer we can get the stove to that high traffic area, the stove is going to do a better job at keeping that dry. If we tuck the stove in the back corner, that entryway is constantly going to be wet. The snow's never going to melt. Also, when you set up your camp, you're going to have guys that are hot-blooded and guys that are cold-blooded. If our stove's in the middle of the tent, everybody's too close to the stove. If we have it in front of one of those front left corner or right corner, the guy that's cold-blooded, he can scoot his cot up by the stove. The guy that's hot-blooded, his cot can be in that back corner, and everybody in the tent is happy. There's no sense in putting the stove in the back corner and traipsing through with muddy boots, snowy boots, with an armload of firewood, trip after trip after trip to the back corner. I trash out the floor of my tent, and if it's in the front corner, if I set it right inside the tent door, I don't even have to walk inside the tent.
If you get a burn hole while you're up in camp, the best thing you could have in camp is a bottle of clear silicone caulking. You just want to make sure it has a flexible finish. That way it'll roll up with the tent when you're done hunting for the year. But if you have a little burn hole, just take a little bit of that and fill in that hole. And definitely try not to start your fire with paper. Paper seems to be the #1 killer. It just floats right up out of that stovepipe and right back down on top of your tent. Another way you could prevent those ember holes from landing on top of your tent would be a rain fly.
Well, you touched on it earlier. Before we talk about a rain fly, I think things to help prevent the burn holes in your tent, like you said earlier, is have an extra piece of stovepipe and get the sparks a little bit further away from the tent.
Right, you can't go too high.
Always use your spark arrestor.
Oh, yeah. And don't use one of those China caps. What happens with those, it just pushes those embers right back down on top of your tent. It's actually going to create more of a problem for you than it's worth.
Now they are uncommon, but they do happen, and that doesn't necessarily mean you did anything wrong. You can do everything right. You can have the extra piece of stovepipe. You can have the damper or the damper and the spark arrestor, but if the stove pops at just the wrong time, the wind's blowing just the wrong direction, you can get a little burn hole in your tent. Doesn't happen that often. You know, you can go 20 years and not have one and then get 2 or 3 in the same trip. Typically they're really small, and like you said, the dab of silicone caulking takes care of them. Anything larger than the silicone caulking will fix. You want to sew a little patch over it. Make sure, if you do use the silicone, to make sure your tent's allowed to dry, or the silicone is allowed to dry thoroughly before you fold the tent up.
So I think this is a good time to talk about flies for our tent. We make our flies out of a milky clear color polypropylene. It's a great benefit to have one on your tent. They're going to help slip the snow, slip the rain, going to add a layer of insulation. The hot embers that we talked about that can occasionally pop out of your stovepipe will land on that cheap polypropylene tarp as opposed to your tent. A milky clear in color, the idea is it'll allow all of the natural daylight to still come into your tent without making the tent any darker. Probably the biggest mistake people make with the fly is you've got a 100% breathable porous cotton canvas tent. They take the fly and they strap it down to the top of that tent just as hard as they can, not trying to prevent it from flopping around in the wind. We need to create a little bit of an air gap on our flies between the slope of our tent and the fly.
The reason you don't want to just lay the fly over the top of the tent is because, you know, we want to retain that canvas's ability to breathe, like we've talked about. And if you seal that whole roof up, you can get into a situation where you'd get some condensation. It wouldn't happen that often. You know, I could see it happening if you're heating with propane being the liquid heat, you know, drying a bunch of clothes off, boiling water on the stove. If you have that fly on there, you can create a situation where you get some condensation in there. So it's easy enough to alleviate that condensation by just, if you stretch the fly tight over the top of the tent, lifting the fly up in the middle on the sides, just a couple inches, and put a gap of dead air in there. And that's that insulation factor that you were talking about, that little gap of dead air, you'll heat that up, and that'll help retain some of that heat for you. I like to say, you know, that is a common question we get is what's the R factor on the canvas? I can honestly say I've never been cold in my tent when the stove is going. I don't care how cold it is outside. You'd be sitting in there playing, you know, cards in your underwear. It's so hot inside the tent. People ask us all the time, how far over on the sides do they overhang? You know, the nice thing about our flies is they're made to fit each individual tent, so you don't have a bunch of extra material that you're trying to accommodate for and, you know, rig up. But having it overlap just the tent 6 inches or so on the side, I think that's a real advantage, at least here in Colorado where we get all the snow. Having the fly very similar to the shape of the roof, the heat from the wood stove keeps the snow sliding off of the fly. A lot of our customers request that we make the fly, you know, 2 foot wider so it overlaps on the side so they can stack coolers and firewood along the side wall of their tent. The reason I don't think that's a good idea is there's no heat out underneath that portion of the fly, which is much more likely to freeze up and the snow back up quicker actually on those areas.
And then once again, then you can't elevate that fly up off the tent. If we come past the eave with your fly 3 feet, it's going to be hard as heck to try and get that lifted up off that canvas slope and allow that tent to breathe. Now the next one comes up is, can I have a fly with an awning? That's a very, very, very popular choice. An awning is strictly going to be the gable slope of the tent, just the gable shape, no walls, no front, just the gable shape. So let's say you called and ordered a 14 by 16 tent and you want to fly with an awning. Rather than your fly being 16 foot, it's going to be 23 feet.
You know, that brings up an interesting point, Chris. Which floor should you get for your tent? We like a 3/4 floor in our tent, but I think the main reason for that is the conditions under which we hunt. You know, we don't do a lot of archery or black powder because we're so busy that time of year. There's always snow on the ground when we're hunting. So our knockoff area is inside the front of our tent. That first 4 foot is dirt. That's why we have that 3/4 floor. That allows a place for the wood stove and what we call the mudroom. We can come in, take our Garharts and our boots off and stomp the snow off there, and the stove will keep that entryway dry. A lot of our customers like the full floor with a zipper cutout. That gives you the option of unzipping the floor and setting the stove in the hole. And that might work well under the conditions they're using the tent. I'd also like to point out that we do offer a full floor and a fire mat, which is a good option. The full floor with the fire mat kind of gives you some versatility. If you want the 3/4 floor, you can always fold, 4 or 5 foot up underneath itself and have the mudroom. Or if you're using the wood stove, you use the full floor and throw down the stove mat.
Right. We also offer the option of having your floor sewn in. We don't think that's the best way to do it, because when you sew that into your tent, you can add anywhere from 35 to 50 pounds onto your tent. It makes folding your tent very difficult as well. But let's say you're in your tent and you spill a pot of coffee. That gets right on the floor, where if you have a loose floor, you just take that floor out, you take it, you shake it off, and you put it back in. Well, if you have a sewn-in floor, you can't do that. And also, it really limits you on what kind of frame you can have. If you really have your heart set on that internal frame where you have no uprights in the middle of your tent, you can't have a sewn-in floor in there, because setting it up makes it very difficult. It's a headache. We actually will not sell you a tent that has an internal frame and a sewn-in floor, because we just don't believe in it. If you do want a sewn-in floor, we could definitely do it, but you're going to have to use our traditional pole system.
The traditional pole set would be a ridge pole that wedges down into 3 or 4 pieces, depending on how long the tent is that you purchased. You'll have 3 or 4 uprights inside the tent, also depending on the size of tent that you purchased. You would have an upright right at the zipper door, an upright dead center in the middle of the tent, and then an upright at the very back wall, and then outside wall poles on approximately 2-foot center. If you are really length conscious, let's say you wanted to take this in on a 4-wheeler, the traditional pole set is the only way to go. A lot less length, a lot less weight, and a lot less poles. Now, when it comes to our clear space internal frame, what makes it popular is just what it's called, clear space frame. You don't have those intrusive uprights inside the tent. Everything's going to be on the inside of the tent. You don't have any outside wall poles. You're going to have legs inside the tent, rafters, and ridges. And what makes this popular is, just like I said, it's a clear space. The downside to it is you're going to have more poles and more length. If you're somebody that's road camping, this is a great way to go. If you're going to try and pack this in, you're probably going to be disappointed in the weight of it and the length of some of the poles.
And you got to remember, on either frame system, you want to make sure to use all your ropes and all your stakes. That's why we provide them for you.
I think the reason the internal frames are so popular these days, it's easier for people to visualize how they set up, which they are very intuitive. Another benefit people achieve or like about the internal frames, gives you a lot more framing inside the tent to hang the organizers, the drying racks, the clotheslines. So that's another reason people like the internal frames.
A lot more stuff to hang your lanterns from and wall organizers, right?
The way you set the tent up with the internal frame, you set the A-frame up and you pull the canvas over it. If you have a sewn-in floor, that prevents you from doing it. You have to unzip the door, throw the poles inside, and go try to set it up. So if you want a sewn-in floor, get the traditional pole set. The sewn-in floors, like Christopher said, are near impossible to keep clean. We sell very few of them.
Right, it's not like you have a Kirby vacuum cleaner up there. If you track in a bunch of mud and snow and things like that, it's impossible to get the floor clean.
Another question we get is, what size of stove should I put in my tent? And that's another question. It's really subjective. Kind of regardless of the size of tent you have, all of the stoves we sell would heat it. I think the real question becomes is for how long. The most common size of tent we sell, the 14 by 16, let's use that for an example. If you're a archery hunter at 9,000 feet, the answer is going to be different than if you're a third season rifle hunter. And really the question becomes is for how long, meaning that the little stove you have to run almost wide open and it'll flat run you out of that 14 by 16, even in third season at 11,000 feet, but for an hour and a half. and you'd be putting more wood in it. So the smaller stove will do a good job in heating a large tent. It just, you have to run it so wide open, it does it for a short period of time. Where a larger stove, you get more fuel in it, you can really bank the wood in there, get a longer, more extended burn time.
And with all of our wood stoves, you could burn wood or coal in them too. Coal's gonna burn longer, and it's a more intense heat too.
Some of our customers are heating their tents with propane, and I certainly understand the convenience of that. I feel more comfortable with a wood stove in our tent because I know I can always walk out the front door of my tent and get more wood. If you happen to get snowed in and you're miles away from civilization, you can't always get to town to get more propane. So I like the idea of a wood stove. They are a little more work, you have to chop your wood, but that dry heat really makes it easier to dry your clothes, prevents the condensation. So there's many benefits to the wood stove. And some of the propane heaters struggle at altitude. Some of them have an oxygen sensor, and you get up above 10,000 feet, they struggle, on a hot day, let alone on a day that's cold inside of a tent. So, make sure you know what you're using before you get up there and have a bad experience. And the new thing nowadays is the pellet stoves. The issue with the pellet stoves, the ones you would be using at elk camp, you typically don't have electricity, so they're the gravity feed pellet stoves. And people certainly like the convenience of them. What they don't like is you still have to get up in the middle of the night and clean them because the gravity doesn't feed it properly where you can go 8 hours without having to shake that thing and get it clean so it starts burning again. So,
What I do to keep that fire going all night long is I give my dad a cup of coffee right before bed. He gets up 2 or 3 times a night. I stay warm all night long.
that's been handed down from generations as well. One thing I'd like to mention is the 16 by 20 is the largest tent that we stock. We make larger tents, we do it all the time, we just make them to order. I do like keeping that 16-foot width and just going longer to get the square footage that you require. Keep in mind, the wider you go, the taller you get to keep the snow and ice running off. And the wider you go, the taller the roof is, the more heat gets up over your head, the more wind profile you're going to catch. So I like staying with that 16-foot width and going longer as needed.
That's definitely one way to get more space is get a bigger tent, a 16 by 40 or 16 by 42 if that's what you want to do. But what a lot of our customers are doing now, and I really like this, is they're getting 2 tents. So let's say they already have a 14 by 16, they had 4 guys in their camp. Well, now a couple of guys have kids that are going hunting with them and they need another tent. So what we recommend is getting another tent that's 14 foot wide, and we can make this however long you want. But usually when you do a second tent, it's for cooking. So they'll get 2 doors on it. You could butt them up to each other, walk through one tent into the other. So the back tent would be sleeping, the front tent would be cooking. Also, let's say you can't find a big enough flat spot for that 16 by 45. You could take one tent, set it down the road 50 feet, and have your sleep tent 50 feet up the road. Also works really good in bear country. A lot of guys are worried about the bears coming in their cook tent. Well, if you have that tent 50 yards down the road, no one will be in there when that bear wants to get in there.
Which is very good in grizzly bear country, absolutely. And another thing that's becoming more and more prevalent or popular is doing just what you said, the 2 tents, but set them up 10 foot apart. Have that distance between the 2, run a ridge pole between the 2, and put a tarp over for a breezeway.
Going back to what you started to say about higher profile for wind and stuff like that, commonly we get questions about, well, I'm 6'4", I think I need a taller peak height. They want to raise a wall height up to 5'6", 6'0", something like that. The downside to doing that, once again, like Roy said, is heat rises. The taller we raise that wall, the higher the peak is. That's where our heat's going to be. We're going to be down on our cot 20 inches off the ground. All of the heat's going to be up high. Also, it raises, if we raise that wall height, it raises the sidewall for wind. It's obviously going to give us a better profile for wind. It's going to catch more wind. Not a good idea. Stay with the standard wall height. You're going to be fine. I think you'd be shocked that the wall height becomes insignificant when you're 6'4", 6'5", whatever it may be, because you will typically have cots and other items pushed over and you don't actually use that wall height. the cots are against the wall, the stoves, your coolers, things like that. So the 5-foot wall height really becomes insignificant if you're 6'4", whatever.
That's a great point, Rick. I'm 6 foot. I think our wall height is kind of like the 10-ounce canvas. I think our wall height is a real sweet spot for wall heights. I'm 6'1", and I can sit on my cot. My cot's against the wall, like you're saying, with my hat on, and it doesn't rub my hat off. Yet when I stand up, I stand next to my cot. The roof of the tent isn't touching my hat either. So I think that is the perfect height so that heat isn't all over your head. Now, if you are adamant about wanting a 5', 6 foot finished wall, we certainly can do it. Keep in mind it does change your cut list on your internal frame. Your yield is different on pipes cut that length versus 5 foot and stuff.
Well, I think the biggest reason to go with a higher wall would be our glamping customer, people that are into the glamorous camping, and they want to put a chest of drawers against the side wall or something like that, or have complete headroom so somebody can walk around a king-size bed without having to crink their neck or something like that. So there are going to be reasons to do it, but for the most part, it's not necessary.
I would like to talk a little bit about cut-size tents. You know, some of our competitors will have you believe a cut-size tent like ours will finish a foot short of the advertised size. That's simply not true. The reason we have a cut-size tent is we are working with 100% cotton canvas, and right in the middle of the roll, the material can change widths a half of an inch or so. Doesn't sound like that big a deal, but you times it by 4 or 5 seams, you can have 2 or 3 inches difference on tents cut at the same day, at the same time, let alone weeks, months, years apart. So every tent we make is a little bit of an individual. We measure every single tent we make. We provide a cut list for that specific tent. That's why it's important for you guys to get your cut list and then put it in a place where you can find it again. So if you break a pole or lose a pole, you can readily replace it. Our finish sizes of our tents are normally very, very close. Like a 14 by 16 might actually finish 14'1" wide and 16'3" long, an inch or two big, or they might finish an inch or two small, but never more than that.
Your cut list for your clear space internal frame is unique to your tent. So keep that piece of paper handy that has your cut list on it. Your cut list is specific for yours. It's not like you can call and just get one off the shelf.
Right. It's always a good idea to laminate not only your cut list, but your invoice too. Because if you ever want to put a rain fly on top of your tent or a floor inside your tent, just like we're talking about the cut list being unique to your tent, we're going to have to make those items unique to your tent as well. So a good place to keep those two items is in your Rubbermaid tub with your tent.
And if you've done some modification to your frame, if you've let your tent shrink and you've shortened your frame up, when you order your fly, you need to provide us with some measurements, because we did not know that you cut your frame down. On our website, we have a link called Frame Fit. Most commonly this happens when people don't use all their ropes and all their stakes. They allow their tent to shrink. And rather than work with the tent to fit the frame again, what they do is they cut their frame down. And really that's not necessary. That link I just mentioned, the Frame Fit link on our website, explains how to work with that tent to fit that frame again.
I'd say another question we get all the time is my frame doesn't fit. We were talking earlier about every tent's an individual. Some of them finish short, long, so you got to follow your cut list. Usually when we get this phone call, the first thing they say is 5 inches too short, and that tells us right away that this 4-way angle is turned the wrong way. You want to make sure this pin is turned towards the inside of your tent. If it's turned towards the outside of your tent when you have your frame together, it moves that pin 5 inches. So I just wanted to take the time, make sure you guys remember that you want that 4-way with the pin to the inside.
That's a great point, Christopher. This is like one of the most common questions we get or issues that comes up. And we really provide this as a service to our customers. Really to complete the frame, you only need a 3-way. We, at no charge, give you the 4-way. And this is handy to create that awning or vestibule. Some people will take a short piece of pipe, maybe 2 foot long, one of the offcuts of the frame they've cut, and hang a lantern from the end of it. So it's really nice to have. That's why we go ahead and give it to you at no charge. but our life would be easier if we didn't give it away.
Right.
So,
Something we did in our camp, because usually when we get to go hunting, it's Friday after work, we get up in the hills, it's already dark. So we just took a self-tapping sheet metal screw and ran it into that side that you'd plug in your awning extension. We don't have an awning on our tent. So you run that in there, and that way, no matter what, you can't put a pole in there. You're not going to do it wrong.
you might be able to stretch your tent. The 100% cotton canvas is pliable. You might be able to stretch your tent that 5 inches and make it fit. It's going to put undue stress on those grommets up at the ridge. Those grommets should never see any stress, and we see them all the time that looks like people have used them incorrectly. So yes, you can do it on the tent if you pull really hard, but you will not be able to do it on the fly. The rain fly will not stretch.
Correct. Another question we get all the time here on the phone is people are excited, they got their tent, they got home, the box is sitting on the porch, they go inside and they start going through their box, they see their angles, they see their cutlass in there, and they keep looking around, but they never see their ropes. Don't worry, they're all rolled up inside your tent. You're going to have to tie those on the first time. The tensioner's already on there, and they're just rolled up inside your tent.
Good point. The reason we do it that way is we provide the proper number of ropes for every tent, and that number varies depending on the size of tent. So as we're folding the tent up, we count or know what size of tent we're folding and throw in the appropriate number of ropes in the middle of the tent.
Another question that comes up quite often is, do I need to pre-shrink my tent before I take it with me? It is a great idea to take your tent on a trial run in the backyard. Set the tent up, rope it and stake it. Let me repeat that part. Rope it and stake it. You can turn the garden hose loose on the seams and let the water penetrate the needle holes. Be sure you leave it up long enough for the sun to dry it, and then you're good to go. What we call this is curing the canvas. The only place a wall tent can leak the first time out, we're not talking about just our tent, anybody's tent. The only place it can leak the first time out is where it's been perforated by the needle. If we rope and stake this tent down so the wind can't take it away, hit those seams with the garden hose, the needle holes will actually shrink down, the cotton threads will swell up, it'll seal your seams forever. Is this mandatory that you do it? Not necessarily. I think it's important that you take the tent on a dry run in the backyard one time before you take it up in the hills, just to make sure your frame fits properly. Plus, if you've done it one time, if it's raining like heck when you get up to your hunting spot, if you've set the tent up one time, you can have it up in no time at all. But make sure if you're going to cure the canvas that you have it roped and staked. We've had countless phone calls over the years where people will call and say, you won't believe what happened to my tent. I had it set up in the backyard yesterday. I got up this morning and now it's in my neighbor's yard. The wind got a hold of it in the middle of the night. You have to rope it and stake it if you're going to cure the canvas. Also, this goes back to why we don't use a ridge band in our tent. If you think about sewing a ridge band in a tent, what you're going to do is put 2 lines of stitching down that tent. If we have a 14 by 16 tent, we're obviously going to have 2 rows of stitching that are 16 foot long, meaning we've perforated the ridge line of that tent in 2 places, 16 foot long, meaning we've done thousands of needle holes in your tent. We're asking for it to do what? To leak. First time it rains, all of those needle holes have a great chance of leaking. Therefore, we're not a big fan of ridge bands.
The reason the ridge bands are more likely to leak than our seams run the up and over, and when we pull on them, we're pulling with the seams, with the ropes. The ridge band is sewn across or lengthwise the tent, and the reason those are more likely to leak is when you stretch that tent out with the ropes, you're actually elongating the holes in the ridge band. So you're not pulling with the seam like you do on a seam of a tent, you're pulling across it. That's why those leak more. It's funny, sitting there listening to you, Grandpa never recommended people going home and setting their tent up and getting it wet. Like you say, there's pros and cons. The reason Grandpa recommended not doing it, here in Colorado, the chances of us getting that prolonged rain, torrential downpour where you got enough moisture that the seams would actually leak was pretty slim. The reason he recommended not doing it was most of the time people would set these up in the backyard in the soft grass. Well, a stake driven into the soft grass doesn't have near the holding power as one driven into the hard ground like up in the mountains. So The reason, like you said, the reason you would set your tent up and turn the hose to it is to cure it, to shrink those needle holes up and make the seams not leak. The reason he would recommend not to do it is the first time a tent gets wet, it's also going to want to shrink more than any other time. And those people will experience that with the soft grass. It'll actually pull the stakes up out of the ground. So is it a good idea? Yeah. Is it necessary? No. I mean, it's one of those catch-22 things.
Just make sure you do it right.
Yeah, if you're going to do it, you know, the ideal location would be someplace where the ground wasn't soft.
Everybody has a different way of making a tent. You'll notice online, different companies take shots at each other. One of the things that people take a shot at us about is using a chain stitch on our tents. In our opinion, the chain stitch is the best stitch out there. If you look at the inseam of your blue jeans, you'll notice that that is a chain stitch. That is the best stitch in the world. I would ask you, when's the last time you had an inseam come undone on your blue jeans? The answer is probably never. Same thing with our tents. Don't buy into the baloney that a lock stitch is better than a chain stitch. The chain stitch is a wonderful machine.
You know, kind of a new industry that opened up for us, Rick, is the glamping. You want to explain what that is?
Glamorous camping.
Glamorous camping.
And it's really quite fun. If you go online and look at some of our pictures, we have a section on our website dedicated to glamorous camping, or what we call glamping. And the biggest difference between a regular tent and a glamping tent is the person that is purchasing it. The inside of the tent, how it's decorated, turns it into a glamorous tent. Whether you put a king-size bed, a nightstand, a chandelier, braided throw rugs. We have people that have glass floors, have platforms out over a stream, and the stream runs under the glass platform. The tent covers the platform. They can see fish swimming underneath the floor. That is glamour.
But my favorite glamping project we've done is when Christopher and I went out to the San Diego Zoo and put up the 44 glamping tents at the Roar and Snore program.
Where a family of 4 could spend the night in the San Diego Zoo. Something they did to make those tents last longer was vinyl flies on them. Just like our polypropylene flies, these ones are made out of vinyl. They both have a UV inhibitor in them. But the vinyl, over a longer period of time, holds up a lot better.
Yeah, that was a unique experience for sure. Having the tents set up where you could see the lions and the giraffes and the elephants and all the different animals they had at the breeding facility was really one of my favorites. But you bring up a good point about the vinyl. Really, the only difference in one of our regular tents and a glamping tents, like Rick was saying, is how they're decorated. We mentioned earlier all of our tents are a little bit unique in size due to the nature of the cotton. So if you're going to be putting a glamping tent up, it's best to order the tent first and then build the deck to fit the tent. It's better if the water on the side of the tent runs right off of the deck instead of sitting there and puddling, or if you're in snow country, having the snow set up on top of that. Just makes that bottom of the tent rot out a little quicker. And yes, the glamping tents tend to be a little bit on the large size, and we tend to decorate them with windows and dividers. They're set up a number of different ways, where they're the internal frames or with the traditional look of the lodge poles.
I think that's what makes them neat is the lodge pole style. People go for the aesthetics where they have a canvas tent, skinned lodge poles, shiny lodge poles, and then a canvas fly over the top of it and decorated to the max inside. I think the biggest point that you touched on, Roy, was we get phone calls from people that want to do glamping sites, and they will call me and say, okay, I'm ready to order my tent. I built a 30 by 40 deck, and now I want a 16 by 20 tent, and they kind of envision a veranda around the tent. The downside to doing that is first time it rains, that rainwater hits the sidewall or hits the deck, and all that rainwater is going to run underneath the sidewall and get your braided rug, carpeting, whatever, soaking wet. So what we want to do is make sure that we build our deck to the same finished dimensions as our tent. That doesn't mean we can't have a front porch on it, to have a couple of chairs out there to set under our canvas awning, but we want to make sure that we touch base on the deck first before we get started on it.
Oh, that reminds me of another great point, Rick. Is we have seen a case or two. It's not very common, but some of the chemicals used to treat the wood of the deck has rotted out the bottom of the tent more quickly than it should have. So that's another reason to have the the tent screwed to the side of the deck instead of having that water, intermixing with those chemicals on the bottom of the tent all the time.
Sitting there all the time.
We are the manufacturer. If you need something special, we can certainly incorporate that into any design. We've made a number of tents that have air conditioning vents. We accommodate special heating. That's one advantage we have over somebody who simply sells tents. Because we are the manufacturer, we know tents inside and out.
Hey, a perfect example of that would be a tent we made recently for a guy down in a dove hunting camp down in Texas. He ordered a tent that was 16 by 20. It had a zipper door on both ends, a screen door on both ends, 10 windows, and a box window air conditioner vent. He just supplied us with the front dimensions of that box window air conditioner vent. He was going to run 200 feet of extension cord to a generator so he didn't have to listen to the generator run. And it turned out to be a fantastic tent. He said a typical daytime height at that time of the year was 102 degrees. He wanted to be comfortable. So the sky's kind of the limit when it comes time to build your tent.
I think one of the things that tends to be a common thread in all the glamping tents is, like you say, how they're decorated, but also the location. Seems like most of the glamping tents, so we just shipped 8 tents to Korea for a gentleman. We've shipped them to the UK, but a common thread amongst all the glamping tents, like the San Diego Zoo, they tend to have some kind of uniqueness to them geographically.
To the setting.
To the setting,
Right.
Which makes them glamorous in and of themselves. So.
Right,
Whether
like the
it be a
tent,
lake view or whatever, right?
or like the tents we have on the beaches of Cozumel, or we have a customer looking into putting glamping tents in the Galapagos Islands right now as well.
I would say if you're contemplating setting up a glamping or you have some tent needs, call a manufacturer, not somebody who's a middleman or a salesman.
Somebody that imports tents and doesn't make tents.
Yeah, draw on our experience. Just sitting here, I can't tell you how many decades of tent making experience we have.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
We mentioned earlier, go online and do a search, Davis Tent reviews or forums, and see what other people say about us. And yeah, there's a lot of good things out there about us. And really what that is about the products, the Sunforger. I mean, that's been out for, since Vivitex lost the patent and Sunforger ran them into the ground in the 50s. So the Sunforger is a proven product that's been around for, 6 decades. It'll be interesting to see the reviews on some of those imported products 60 years from now.
How long they held up
Exactly.
in the sun. Even a glamping tent that somebody imports, who knows, they haven't been on the market long enough to get a great UV rating on them as far as, was this going to last 6 months in the sun, a year in the sun? That's a good point.
It's funny, one of the websites recently challenged, which material is best, and they wanted to compare their 12-ounce canvas to 10-ounce. That's like comparing half-inch rope to quarter-inch rope. Yeah, the 12-inch is going to be stronger. But I actually accepted the challenge comparing our 10-ounce to their 12-ounce, as long as it wasn't just a tear strength test. If you would test the 2 different materials for breathability, and if you performed an accelerated weather test, I bet the Sunforger 10-ounce would outperform the imported 12-ounce.